give just a Lincoln Heights welcome to Jeremy.
Good morning, church. It is great to be with you. To those who are in the room with me, those of you who are watching and listening online, so glad to have you guys with us as well. If you are here, hopefully you got your bracelet and you are adding to the collection. I don't know if you're wearing them all or storing them or displaying them somewhere at your house, but maybe you're thinking, okay, this is like the 7th week and I've been pushing my brain hard. You know, like it's 7 weeks of memorizing things, and if you've been removed from school for a little bit, maybe you're a little mentally fatigued, right? You're a little tired, and you're thinking, this is a lot. There's a lot of things to memorize. I just want to encourage you today of what the human brain is capable of. You can memorize 7 verses. You're going to be okay. It's going to be all right. Even after today, you have room for one more. In fact, I was looking up like just interesting things that people have memorized, and I discovered something I didn't know. Do you know there is a competition of who can memorize the most digits of the number pi? I don't know. Like, if you didn't have a hobby, maybe it's something you want to go pursue, right? But evidently this is like a sport. There's a competition of how many digits can you remember of pi and can you recite. Now, they also time you because we're getting to the point where you have to see how fast you can recite all these. And the current record, believe it or not, is more than 70,000 digits of pi. And the time it took to do that, 17 hours and 14 minutes, which is impressive on so many levels. Number one, that you can remember 70,000 plus digits of pi. And number two, that you could spend 17 hours of your life reciting it straight. I mean, can you imagine something worse? Like, this is awful. I literally want to know, the person who did this, what is your day job? Like, what do you do for a living that you have room for that? Clearly, it's not someone with young kids, because I do not have the space in my brain for that many digits of pi, but evidently, they got room for it. I thought, wow, that is incredible. So, just want to encourage you, if you thought 7 verses was a lot, you got it, okay? You can do this, no big deal. So, if you've got your Bibles today, I want to encourage you to get those out. We are going to be in Philippians chapter 4. We're going to look at the context of this verse, and hopefully you will quickly understand why that is important to do, especially with this verse. But let's look at it in case you don't have a bracelet on right now. Week 7 memory verse, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And it's easy to see, isn't it, why this is such a popular verse. In fact, you may not have ever read the Bible. You may be new to the whole church thing. And I bet you've heard this verse because Christians love this verse. And it's easy to see why. But maybe you look at a verse like that and you go, what was the author talking about? Like, originally, what was that about? Or does it, truly become a free-for-all, use it however you want to use it? Well, that's how most of the time we use it, right? I don't know if you've seen this, but here's a few examples of the ways you can see Philippians 4:13 out in the wild, right? Like, how do people just use it? The boxer Evander Holyfield, when he would sign his signature, would often sign below it Philippians 4:13. I don't know if you can see it there, but literally, if you wanted to know how does he have the power to beat people up, he can do all things through Christ who gives him strength, right? Philippians 4:13, you may go, well, that's just a weird anomaly, not as weird as you may think. Tim Tebow famously had the little eye patches where, if you can see carefully on that, literally underneath his eyes says Philippians 4:13. So how does Tebow do whatever Tebow does? I don't even know, right? Like, he can do all that, through Christ who gives him strength. MMA fighters have it tattooed on them. In fact, this guy's got it on his right arm. Like, literally, I would imagine the arm he's punching people with, it's like this metaphor of like, I can do all things through Christ. Just literally, as he's looking down, it's like, yes, I can beat you to a pulp through Christ who gives me strength. And maybe that's not your thing, but you might have seen it on a meme. We use this all over. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't do something when the Bible says you can do all things through Christ. Can I get an amen? Woo! Pumped up yet? I mean, let's go do something awesome, right? Because that's what this verse clearly is about. One seminary professor named Dr. Ben Witherington calls Philippians 4:13 the Superman verse. And the reason he calls it that is because this verse often gets used like the superhero that can't be stopped, that can do anything. And so I know if you've been here throughout the series, Chris has used images to try to use like as mental association. So here's my image for today. If you want to have an image to associate as you memorize this verse, just think of the Superman verse. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And Christians have been using it this way for a long time. And again, I gave you a few examples, but let's think about how we could logically, if we just take it at surface value, how we could logically apply this if we didn't want to have any context at all. Like, let's just use the verse by itself. Do you want to dunk a basketball? Hey, you can do all things through Christ who gives you strength, right? Doesn't matter if you're 5 feet tall. Like, you can do all things, right, through Christ who gives you strength. You want to get that new promotion at work? You can do all things through Christ who gives you strength. You want to get ripped in the gym? You can do all things. You may go, no one's using it like that. There are literally like tattoos of swollen dudes, right? Like, check it out, I'm in the gym, ripping my shirt off because I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. You want that girl or that guy to finally notice you? You can do all things through Christ who gives you strength. You want your company to be wildly successful? You can do all things through Christ who gives you strength. Do you want to be the first person on Mars? You can do all things through Christ who gives you strength. Now, hopefully you're going, okay, I think we're pushing this a little too far, right? Like, clearly that can't mean anything we want it to mean. Well, now, is it possible that God will indeed give you the strength to do any of those things we just mentioned? Sure. It's possible. God could do that. Is that what Paul is talking about in this verse? I would submit to you that it's not. That's not actually what Paul was writing when we got this verse. That if we were to be honest, the way that we normally use Philippians 4:13 is normally as an explanation in our own selfishness in our prayer life. Here's something I want. I'm going to ask God for it, and I'm going to put a verse behind it so that it sounds good and it sounds spiritual, and that way I am spiritually justified in whatever it is I want to ask God for, and that's the way this is often used. Now, if you notice in different translations, they render this verse differently. In fact, the NIV, which is one that likely a lot of you have, the NIV says it slightly different. It says it like this: I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Now you might go, well, that version isn't as cool because it doesn't stand alone. You like don't know what he's referring to, which is, I would say, what a lot of versions do, because it makes you look and go, what is the this Paul's talking about? Like, what has Paul been referencing up to this point that he's now making this big, bold statement? And that's what I want to look at today, the bigger context behind this powerful verse. And I want to suggest to you that this verse is far better than you probably realize. It's far bigger than you probably realize. But we have to challenge the way we often use it in order to see what I would suggest Paul is doing. Now, in the verses preceding this, Paul is setting up an argument, and he's using his own example. He's using his own situation to set up what we eventually get to in verse 13. But let's go back a little bit. If you've got your Bible, let's go back to verse 10. And let's see what Paul says leading up to this verse to understand what he's talking about. Paul writes this: "How I praise the Lord that you are concerned about me again. I know you have always been concerned for me, but you didn't have the chance to help me." So Paul's writing to this church, more likely a group of churches, right, in this city. And he's saying, you have had this ability to help me. Now, there's an implication here that they have financially helped Paul, that they have financially met Paul's needs, and now he's responding to that. Their concern of him is growing, and he's acknowledging that. But notice that his reaction is a little bit strange. Paul doesn't say thanks. He doesn't say, thank you for what you've provided for me. Thank you for your concern for me. No, he praises God. Rather than thanking the people that did it, he instead redirects this and praises God. In fact, some scholars have referred to this as Paul's thankless thanks. Because he's acknowledging it, he's expressing gratitude, but he's not showing it to the person who did it. Now, to illustrate why this would feel a little weird, let's imagine that you had a friend. And you really loved this person, you really rallied around them, and you just thought the world of them. And their vehicle just died. I mean, just died. They had no more vehicle. They needed something, but they didn't have the money for it. And you knew, you know what, if I sacrificed, maybe if I sold a few things, I could buy them a vehicle. It would mean the world to them. This would be such a cool way to bless this friend of mine. So you decide, I'm going to do whatever I have to do, sell whatever I have to sell, move things around, but I'm going to buy this vehicle for my friend because I know this would be a cool moment of generosity that would really mean the world to them. So you figure it out. You buy the car, you give it to them, and they go, oh my goodness, this is incredible. Thank you, Jesus. And you think, yeah, but also, yeah, Jesus, but also, and then they just keep going on. I cannot believe Jesus provided me with this car. No, Jesus did that. And Jesus, uses people to do the things that, at some point, right? Wouldn't you try to kind of be like, yes, I'm so glad that this is like a cool moment between you and Jesus, but also me, also it cost me, Jesus used my money to do this thing that you're now praising Jesus for. If we're honest, there would be some weird tension there where if they never acknowledged you, never thanked you, never even made any recognition that you were a part of it, that if it was just them and Jesus, you would be satisfied on one level, and I suspect you would have a little bit of weirdness on another level. That's what Paul's doing here. He is praising God for what the Christians in this community have done for him, but he's not thanking them. Now, why? What's going on here? Well, we're beginning to realize Paul views this differently than maybe you and I view our stuff. And we're going to see this as we explore these verses. Go to the next verse, verse 11. Paul says, not that I was ever in need, for I have learned how to be content with whatever I have. This is fascinating. Paul says, I was never in need, which logically, if you look at his words, you can tell he was definitely in need. For sure in need, but from Paul's point of view, he says, I was never in need. Well, how are you never in need, Paul? Well, he goes, well, I've learned how to be content with whatever I have. Therefore, I wasn't in need in the first place. I think this is why Paul doesn't thank them in the preceding verse. Because the gift is not the thing Paul is celebrating. He's not saying, yes, I can finally pay those bills. Yes, I can finally eat again. He's not focused on whatever the gift actually did for him. He's focused on the relationship. Yes, God showed up. God moved the Christians in this community to meet my needs. That is what means the most through him. He is talking about how to get through difficult times, acknowledging that Jesus has shown up for him. Now, we might think, based on the way this verse is usually used, that Paul must have been riding some high when he wrote this. He is on, win after win after win. He's just converted the empire to Christianity. Paul must have been doing so awesome right now. And yet, here's a little doozy of a detail that we often overlook when we apply this verse. Do you know that Paul was in prison when he wrote this letter? Now, more specifically in that context, he's under house arrest. He doesn't even have the ability to go where he wants to go, to do what he wants to do. He's got people watching him and monitoring him and giving him permission to do anything that he gets to do. That's the context in which he says, look, I've learned how to be content through all of this. He's not writing this from the winner's podium going, hey, I'm coming off of a string of really awesome moments in my career. Things are going great. No, Paul's in a situation that you and I would go, I don't ever want to be in that situation. That's what Paul is in when he writes these words. He says, I've learned how to be content. in any situation. I wasn't in need. And most of us would go, Paul, you're in need right now. Like you're literally under house arrest. Like how do you say you're not in need? And yet here's one of the things I think we can take away from Paul's logic here. You have everything you need to be content. Now let's be honest. Some of you read that sentence and you don't believe me. You think, nope. He doesn't know my story, doesn't know my situation, doesn't know what I'm going through right now. I don't have everything I need to be content. And maybe for you, there's a checklist of things that you go, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And until those things are resolved, until those things are figured out, I do not have everything I need to be content. And here's what I just want to challenge you, wherever you're at on that statement. What if this were true of you today? Just humor me if that seems far off. What if that was a true sentence about your life right now? For some of you, this would be a game changer. If you really could believe that you have everything you need right in this moment to be content. And this is what Paul is saying. It doesn't matter if I have a lot, if I have a little. I've learned how to be content. I wasn't in need. And we're going, wait, what? Paul has learned how to be content in a situation that many of us will go, I don't think so. Back in 2020, my family was living in Oregon, and in July of that year, there were these massive wildfires that just kind of took over Oregon, and it was incredibly devastating. 9 people were killed by these fires. About 5,000 houses and structures were burnt to the ground. I mean, it was a big deal in Oregon, especially if you lived there. And I remember it was the first time in my life that our house had been put on like a notice of an evacuation system. And so there was different numbers they would give you as to what level of threat the fires were to your home, and you would just kind of monitor it, like, right? And so I remember all of a sudden finding out, hey, your home is in evacuation level 1. Like, you need to be aware of this. And they had numbers of, like, each number meant a different level of severity and things that they recommended you doing. And level 1 was just to start thinking this through, that you may have to evacuate your home in the days to come as this fire progresses. Like, be aware of that. Now, again, I've never lived in an evacuation zone for anything. And that was kind of like a new feeling that we're going, oh, we might have to leave. Like, that would be strange. Well, then as the fires kept burning, kept raging on, we got elevated to level 2. And level 2 was start packing things. Like, have your things ready so that if you get up to the next level, you already have everything ready to go. And there's a number of things that they recommended you do. One of them that I thought was an interesting memory, I've never done it since, was go through all your electronics in your home, things that you're not going to bring with you, and take photos of the serial numbers. Because if all of this burns to the ground, you're going to have to make insurance claims on all the things that you lost. That was just kind of a weird feeling to go through and going, okay, I might lose this TV, might lose this, right? Like, you're just documenting for insurance reasons, like, hey, I'm going to lose these things if we have to evacuate and the fire comes to our house. But then I remember my wife and I in our bedroom starting to pack our clothes of like, all right, let's set aside some bags that would be ready. So if we have to, at the last minute, we have to evacuate, we have our bags ready to go. And so one evening we just kind of started going through our clothes like, all right, what do we need to bring? Now, that's when I realized my wife and I have very different views of what is essential to pack, right? Like, for me, I'm going streamline. Like, maybe 3 days worth of clothing, I'll rotate them, wash them, we'll be good. I can survive off this. Meanwhile, I'm looking at my wife with just stacks and piles of stuff. She's got dress clothes and workout clothes and boots and all sorts of things. And then at one point I look over and she's got our kids' baby clothes in a pile. I'm like, Michelle, you are going to bring our kids' baby clothes on an evacuation? She's like, well, I don't want these to burn. I'm like, okay, what are we doing with all this stuff? Like, very different understandings, but that was helpful. That was helpful to literally imagine if we had to lose all of this, what am I okay losing? And how would it affect me if I had to lose this or lose that? See, I suspect that most of us would go, oh, I need a lot to be content. And maybe you're feeling like right now, I don't have enough to be content. I mean, it might be easy for someone next to you to be content, but not what you have Not what you're going through, not the challenges that you face. And yet I suspect if we were forced to, that maybe we would see some of the logic Paul's using here going, yeah, we don't actually need all the things that we think we need to be content. Paul's got a different perspective. Could it be possible that right now you really do have all you need to be content? Let's keep exploring what Paul says next. Verse 12. Paul says, I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. Now notice the extreme here. Paul's not just praising poverty. Some Christians do that, like poverty in itself is awesome. That's not the argument Paul's making. Paul's going to both extremes. Look, I know what it is to have nothing. I know what it is to have a lot. I've experienced both. And he says this, I have learned the secret of living in every situation. I love that phrase. Living in every situation, whether it is with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or with little. So you begin to realize Paul's got a different way of thinking, a different way of processing this. Now, at first glance, we might want to say, oh, Paul has become self-sufficient, right? Paul has learned how to just provide for what he needs. And yet I would say that is the wrong way to read it, because that misses the relational dynamics that Paul is referencing here. Paul's not self-sufficient. I would say Paul has become God-dependent. Paul has learned to say, you know what? It's not about all these external circumstances. It's about looking to God, and God is going to take care of me. And he's using this response from the church as the latest example of that. See, God got this church to reach out to me and take care of me. And so he's just keeping his eyes on God and the fact that God is showing up for him. And so I would say we can learn from this that contentment comes from dependency on Jesus, not on self-sufficiency. And yet we tend to flip it. When I can become self-sufficient, then I will experience contentment. And if that is your definition, I suspect contentment will always be just a little bit beyond your grasp. I'm close. I'm getting real close to being content. I'm just not quite there yet. But if you go, no, it's not on me taking care of me. It's on me learning to trust God in new ways. See, we often think, once I get that job, then I'll be content. Once I get that promotion, then I'll be content. Once I get that new relationship, then I'll be content. Once I get the recognition that has eluded me, that I've been waiting for, then I'll be content. Once that success happens for me, then I'll be content. But contentment comes from dependency on Jesus, not on self-sufficiency, which means you can be rich and content, or you can be poor and content. Because contentment is not based on what you have or even the circumstances in your life if you've learned how to become God dependent. That's why Paul says elsewhere in the book of 1 Timothy, he says, yet true godliness with contentment is itself great wealth. Contentment is itself great wealth. After all, we brought nothing with us when we came into the world, and we can take nothing with us when we leave it. So if we have enough food and clothing, let us be content. I love this, the simplicity of that last phrase. Let us be content. Friends, what if Christians were known for that? What if we were known as the people of contentment? What if the common reaction that the world had to watching Christians was that we were content in every circumstance, and it defied the odds and it defied explanation, and people couldn't figure it out, and so they constantly asked us, why are you the way you are with what you're going through? Oh, it's because God. I've learned how to be content because of God. I mean, would that not baffle people? Like, you wouldn't have to go out and preach the gospel. You would just live your life. People would go, what on earth is allowing you to have that perspective with what you're going through? Oh, I'm glad you asked. It's because I trust God. And so I've learned how to be content. We could be people of contentment, but sadly, that is not what we're known for. No, we're just as worldly as the rest of the culture. We want things just as bad. We're often just as into our money and our power and our fame as the rest of the world. But Paul is just saying, let us be content. Let us be the people that model it. Our aim should not be for self-sufficiency. And even though this is often how we present the American way, right? Never need anything from anyone. Like that's what it means to have arrived. No. Paul's saying as Christians, we should be constantly figuring out new ways to depend on God regardless of what we're going through. I love the way that the author Jonathan Merritt describes Philippians 4:13. He says, Paul isn't telling Christians that they should dream bigger dreams, which is how we normally use it. He is reminding them that they can endure the crushing feeling of defeat if those dreams aren't realized. He's not encouraging Christians to go out and conquer the world. He's reminding them that they can press on when the world conquers them. I would suggest that Philippians 4:13 is actually far more profound than most of us understand. It's far more profound than the way that we tend to use it. Oh, I can do all these cool things. No, I can get through stuff that other people would say there's no way you're going to make it. That's the stuff I can get through because of Christ who gives me strength. So with this in mind, let's revisit the verse. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Rather than looking at how much or how little Paul has, Paul goes, look, I can get through any situation that I have faced, including the one he's in the moment, because of God. Because God continues to show up in his life. So my question for us today is this. Are we learning how to depend on God, or are we learning how to be more self-sufficient? Which of those two would you say more accurately describes the trajectory you're on? Every day, are you getting better and better at depending on God? Or every day, are you getting closer and closer to some sense in your mind of self-sufficiency? I'm working my way there. I'm almost there. I'm going to be there. Because if you're trying to become self-sufficient, because that's how you think you're going to find contentment, Paul's going, you're not going to experience it. You're not going to see what Paul has seen. Early in my marriage, we went through a really difficult season. We came into the housing market at the absolute wrong time. And so we bought our first home, and my wife's a realtor. We thought, this is awesome. We own our home. And then bought a second home and started renting out the first home. And we were really intent. We're going to make good financial decisions. We're going to set our family up. We wanted to have kids, all this. And so we were really trying to set ourselves up well. Well, in 2008, I don't know if any of you recall something unique about that year. The housing thing goes all the way south. Everything falls apart. We realize, hey, financially, we're in a mess. And we're not going to get out of this mess unless we make some really hard decisions. And so we began a series of really hard decisions. We ended up foreclosing on one of our houses and had to short sell our second house. In case you don't know how that works, that's like the worst thing you could do to your credit score. So early in my marriage, I lose my first two houses. My finances are in the tank, and my credit score is about as ugly as you can make it, and no one will loan me anything. And so we end up realizing, hey, the only way we're going to be able to live is like we're going to have to rent somewhere, and we're going to try to rebuild this. I mean, we've gone so far from where we began, and this is not going to go well, so we end up renting this home. This very simple home, and it was kind of like this, we came from these houses we loved, we had a pool, we had all these cool things, and it was like, nope, just a very simple home. We're going to reset. We're going to go do this. And then we started looking at all of our finances, trying to make sense of like, we're in a bad way. And I remember I drove a vehicle that I loved. It was a Nissan Xterra. It was supercharged. I loved this SUV, but it was fully paid off. I remember as we were looking at our finances, I was like, it doesn't make sense. For me to drive this vehicle. I could drive something simpler, and we could use this money toward these debts that we have and all the situation we're in. So I ended up selling that, and we ended up realizing that my wife's grandma was at an age where she wasn't driving anymore. So I bought my wife's grandma her 95 Buick Century. She's original owner, bought it for $1,000. When I tell you I drove a grandma car, I literally drove a grandma car. Like a grandma was the only owner of this vehicle. And I remember driving this thing and just feeling like I have no more pride in anything I own, right? Like, I live in this rental home that I don't love. I've lost these 2 houses that I thought were awesome and were going to be my financial future. I don't even get to enjoy the vehicle I drive, which I loved. I drive a 95 Buick Century, and in case you're like, what's the big deal with that? We had ashtrays in this car. Kids today don't know why there'd be ashtrays in a vehicle. That's the level of vintage I'm talking about, okay? You had ashtrays in this car. I mean, like, this was just like a whole different genre of vehicle. They don't make them like that anymore, and this is what I drove around day in and day out. And I remember just thinking, man, this has not gone according to plan. And we had just started a family at that point, and I just remember thinking, I mean, this is a bad way to start my married life. Like, my family life has not got started on the note that I thought. Our finances are in the tank. I mean, I just remember feeling so defeated at this point in my life. Now, I'm quite a bit removed from that season. I can look back and go, well, now I can realize that season was actually very pivotal for Michelle and I. And the amount of growth in both of our lives was very high in that season. In fact, I can look back and go, I had some significant changes in my career in that season. I can look back and go, in that season, we actually decided to become foster parents and brought new kids into our family. And that was a huge change for us. And in fact, that season was what allowed us to rebuild our lives, to refigure things out in a much different level. And really, we trace it back to then, not when we got married, because we had this giant reset in the middle of it. Now, after 3 years of renting, we had got our credit good enough. We had saved up enough money. We were able to buy another house. And I remember thinking when we moved into that house, just the amount of gratitude I had. Thinking, okay, we're starting to get back on track. We're starting to figure out how to get out of this, financial hole that we were in. Now, as I tell you that story, not because that's a fun story to tell. That's a very tough season of my life. But here's what I want you to think about. If you think about that season of my life, and I bet you have similar seasons, when does Philippians 4:13 apply? Now, the way most of us would use it, we would wait till we come out of the season. We get into the new house, things are starting to look good again, and we'd say, Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Look, I'm back. I did it. I would say that Philippians 4:13 is a great verse when we moved in to the rental home. When I felt like I was a failure, like you have screwed this thing up, you have messed up your family, you have messed up your future, you have dug yourself into this hole. That is when Philippians 4:13 is an amazing verse. It's like, this is just a circumstance. It's hard. It's difficult. A lot of challenges in that season. But I can do this through Christ who gives me strength. And as I look back, Jesus showed up in so many ways in that season. I wouldn't want to go through it again. It wasn't my favorite season of life. But Jesus showed up in powerful ways. And that's the reality that Paul is talking about here. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to use this as the Superman verse. To say it really is an incredible verse, but not in the way that we tend to use it. It's not giving you a green light to go make some audacious goal or some crazy dream and say, yeah, put God's stamp of approval on it. It's saying when your back's up against the wall, and you think, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how to get through this. I don't know how to endure this. So you know what? I can do all this through Christ who gives me strength. So what are you going